Have you ever heard some psychological fact and just thought, that sounds right, but how do they really know that? Well, it's definitely not guesswork. Psychologists have this really powerful way of sorting out what's a convincing idea from what's actually real. And right at the heart of that is the experiment. So today, we're going to pull back the curtain on how researchers design these studies to figure out what's what.
Look, we all use our common sense, our intuition, just to get through the day. And you know what? Most of the time, it works out okay. But here's the catch. When it comes to understanding why people do the things they do, our intuition can be, well, spectacularly wrong. It's so often built on myths or assumptions that just feel true.
Okay, let's take a classic example. I'm sure you've heard this one, maybe even said it yourself. The big worry that all this text-speak, great and you're, is just completely wrecking young people's ability to write properly. It feels so obvious, right? I mean, a breakdown in formal language has to be a bad thing for literacy, or does it?
Well, this is exactly why we need evidence, not just intuition. A study back in 2008 found the complete opposite of what common sense tells us. The kids who were really fluent in textisms actually scored better on verbal reasoning tests. It's a shocking result, right? And it's the perfect example of why we can't just go with our gut. We need a real system to test our ideas.
And that really gets to the heart of it. As the psychologist Hugh Coolican says, getting a handle on research methods is like installing a top-of-the-line crap detection system in your brain. It's a critical thinking tool that lets you see right through weak arguments and demand actual proof, whether it's coming from an ad, a politician, or some headline on the internet.
So, if we can't always trust our intuition, what can we trust? Well, for psychologists, the answer is the true experiment. This is the gold standard. It's the most powerful tool we have to figure out if one thing truly causes a change in another. You can almost think of it as a recipe for discovering the truth. And every good recipe has a few core ingredients. First, the researcher takes one specific thing and changes it on purpose. We call that the independent variable. That's the potential cause. Second, and this is absolutely critical, they do their best to keep everything else exactly the same. And third, they measure the outcome, the dependent variable, to see if that one change actually made a difference. Let's make that more real. Let's say you want to test that old idea that hot weather makes people more aggressive. Okay, your independent variable, the thing you change, is the room temperature. So you'd set up maybe a hot room and a cool room. Your dependent variable, the effect you measure, is aggression. You'd have to find a way to measure that, of course, like maybe seeing how many times people get angry while trying to solve a frustrating puzzle.
Now, the hardest part of this whole recipe is step 2, keeping everything else the same. And the reason it's so hard is because of these pesky things called confounding variables. They're the sneaky alternative explanations that can completely mess up your results. Like in our heat experiment, what if the hot room was also way noisier than the cool room? Then you wouldn't know if people were getting aggressive from the heat or from the noise. The whole point of a good experiment is to get rid of those confounds, so the only thing that could be the cause is your independent variable.
All right, so we've got our recipe, but just like in the kitchen, you can use the same ingredients but put them together in a few different ways. Researchers have to pick a structure or a design that's going to work best for the question they're asking. So let's check out 2 of the most common setups.
First up, you've got the independent samples design. This is pretty straightforward. You use totally different groups of people for each part of the experiment. So one group of people goes into the hot room, and a completely different group goes into the cool room. Simple enough. Then you've got the repeated measures design. Here, the very same group of people goes through all the conditions. So they'd be tested in the hot room, and then maybe on another day, they'd come back and be tested in the cool room.
Now that repeated measures design sounds amazing at first, right? You're comparing people to themselves so you totally control for any individual differences. But it's got one huge weakness, something called order effects. Just think about it. If you do the aggression task in the hot room first, by the time you do it again in the cool room, you might do better just because you've had some practice. Or you might do worse because you're just bored or tired. And that change has absolutely nothing to do with the temperature.
So you see, it all comes down to trade-offs. With independent samples, you don't have to worry about order effects, which is great. But you run the risk that your 2 groups were just different from each other to begin with. Maybe one group was just naturally more aggressive. With repeated measures, your groups are perfectly matched because they're the same people, but now you have to worry about those pesky order effects. There's no single best design. It really just depends on what you're studying.
Now, everything we've talked about so far is describing the perfect world of the lab. Super controlled, super clean. But the real world is messy.
And sometimes it's just plain impossible or even unethical to run one of these perfect true experiments. So what do researchers do then?
So, just to recap, a true experiment is all about control. And a huge part of that control is being able to randomly put people into the different groups. This literally means that for every single person who joins the study, you're flipping a coin to decide if they go in the hot room or the cool room. This random assignment is the absolute best way to make sure your groups are basically equal before the experiment even starts.
But what if you can't do that? For instance, you can't just randomly assign some kids to a great new teaching method and other kids to an old one. They're already in their classrooms. And that's where the quasi-experiment comes in. It looks and feels a lot like a true experiment, but it's missing that key ingredient, usually the random assignment. It's a really practical compromise that lets us study important things out in the real world, even if we have to give up a little bit of that perfect control.
Okay, so why should any of this matter to you? Who cares about independent variables and quasi-experiments? Well, because understanding just the basics of how this stuff works makes you a way smarter, way more critical consumer of all the information that's thrown at you every single day.
So, if you're going to take anything away from this, here's the rundown. First, the whole entire point of an experiment is to be able to say with confidence that A causes B. Second, the true experiment does this by changing one thing and one thing only. Third, researchers have to choose a design, and every choice has its own pros and cons. And finally, the big one. Knowing this helps you ask the right questions when you see some crazy headline so you can decide for yourself if it's legit.
So there you have it. You now know the basic recipe for scientific discovery in psychology. So the next time you hear a piece of common sense, something that everybody knows about how people work, I want you to pause for a second. Think like a researcher. How would you actually design an experiment to see if it's true? What would you change? What would you measure? And what other sneaky variables would you have to control for? It is such a powerful way to think, and it's how we move from just guessing about the world to actually knowing.